So help me God. So help me God.
So help me God.
So help me God.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to So Help Me Pod, a podcast on the presidents, their faith, and the impact that their faith had on presidential policy during their time in the White House. My name is Rob Lee. I am a doctoral candidate at the Pacific School of Religion. And with me today, I have Scott, my younger brother, who is not a doctoral candidate.
Yes.
He is my younger brother. And I'm going to teach him in some ways about the presidents. We're going to talk about... Go ahead.
I do have my doctorate coming in mail soon because I did.
Just like you have your
online
ordination
stuff
in the mail too. So,
yes. So technically, I technically have it, but yeah. Keep going though.
You got your prescription pad and everything. That's the thing I'm looking most forward to about getting my doctorate. Anyway, today we have an interesting episode for you. We're going to talk about George Washington, our first president, the way that George Washington impacted our country, the way we look at our history, and the way our history is impacted because of his administration. President George Washington was our first president. He lived from 1732 to 1799, the only president to pass away during the 18th century. He served as president from 1789 to 1797, 2 terms, and he is an Anglican, but many scholars consider him to be that of a deist, which we'll talk about in just a second. To get to know President Washington, it's important to know that about his life, he was a very wealthy man. He inherited his first enslaved persons, which unfortunately you could do at the time. You could inherit people in his father's will at the age of 11. By the end of his life, he would go on to enslave over 500 persons through the horrific acts of the transatlantic slave trade and chattel slavery. One of the most important and impactful moments of Washington's young life came when he contracted smallpox while in Barbados during his only trip off the North American continent. His surprise attack on a French fort led to the start of the French and Indian War in 1754. And Scott, this is interesting. You will recall in our community that we live in, Fort Dobbs. Fort Dobbs is a French and Indian War historic site. It was a colonial outpost during that conflict that was staffed by the British Army that fought native persons and all kinds of different people during that conflict. So that's really interesting, kind of a cool connection for us there. Scott, do you remember hanging out at Fort Dobbs growing up there, going to scout camp and all that fun stuff?
And they even built the new fort out there now.
They do have a replica fort that is really, really impressive. We took our girls out there, my daughters, and they really enjoyed learning about that.
Shout out Fort Dobbs.
Yeah, go to Fort Dobbs. Check out Fort Dobbs and donate to Fort Dobbs too. Be a friend of Fort Dobbs. It's an important thing.
Non-sponsored.
Yeah, they aren't our sponsors, but if they want to be, they're welcome to be.
Shout out. Let's go.
President Washington was married for 40 years to Martha Washington, with their wedding occurring in 1759. Martha was a widow, having been married previously, and she would eventually outlive her second husband by 3 years. She died in 1802 at the age of 70 after managing Mount Vernon, where the president lives. George Washington is a president's president, right? Like when you think of the presidency, you think of George Washington. Much of the decorum and understanding of America's leadership came from his example. This includes resigning his military commission prior to serving office. We want people in our public office who are not military leaders. In terms of current service, they're welcome to have served previously, but for them to serve congruently is a big no-no, and that is in large part due to George Washington. You can also trace the service of only 2 elected terms as president to George Washington. That was a decorum that would last until the 1930s when Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected president, but it would later be codified in the Constitution after FDR died. They
He did
also
4, right?
he served he served 3 and change because he died during his 4th term. And finally, the one of the ways that we still honor presidents today is by using the term Mr. President when addressing them, rather than Your Majesty or Your Excellency. Given the choice between the 3, Scott, which would you use? Would you use Your Majesty, Your Excellency, or Mr. President?
Emperor. Actually.
Emperor. So
Yeah,
yeah. I would maybe go with Your Holiness.
that's cool.
Go with a theocracy kind of thing.
Yeah.
Washington lived at a rather interesting place that you can still visit to this day, a place called Mount Vernon, a sprawling estate that overlooks the Potomac River. Literally, you can stand in his front yard and see a beautiful panoramic view of the Potomac. It's really quite stunning. But you have to kind of hold that intention with the fact that even though it was his home, his estate, it was staffed and ran by enslaved persons. You can still visit it today. I mean, it's right outside DC. It's a beautiful place to visit. And in fact, President Washington and Martha are buried on the grounds, and you will include certain significant history. And one of the things I do love about Mount Vernon is that they have done significant work lately on remembering the enslaved individuals on Washington's plantation. So
Shout out Washington's Plantation.
yeah,
We're not sponsored, but I hear it's beautiful.
they're definitely not a sponsor. First family connection. So Scott, this is really interesting for you and for me. George Washington Parke Custis, George Washington's step grandson, was Robert E. Lee's, our collateral ancestor's father-in-law. President Washington had no heirs beyond that of his stepchildren, who belonged to Martha Washington from her previous marriage to Daniel Parke Custis. Martha was married to Custis for 7 years until his untimely death from a heart attack in 1757. Miss Custis would marry the future president 18 months after Daniel's death. Martha Dandridge Custis Washington would subsequently become the first lady of the United States and take that title upon her husband's inauguration in 1789. Washington's post-presidency would be short. He left the office of the presidency in 1797 to return to Mount Vernon for what many consider a well-earned retirement. He had essentially brought the fledgling nation to fruition and had, prior to that, fought for its independence. Now, this is interesting fun fact that I learned. One of the things that I did not know, but in my studies with Mount Vernon's database and website, he was terrified of being entombed alive, which I guess is fair. That's a fair fear, which could happen back then, and directed his private secretary to wait 3 days after he was declared dead by medical officials for him to be buried. According to those in the room, his last words, "'Tis well," in response to his plans for his burial. The second family, Scott, we have a second family and national connection to Washington, would come after the late president had died. You may have heard this, Scott. I don't know how familiar you are with this, but the famous words that eulogize President Washington after his death in 1799 come from a member of our family, the Lee family. George Washington was celebrated as first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. And Scott, you may parenthetically remember that because Nana would talk about that all the time when we were visiting Washington, D.C. as kids. I don't know if she knew this connection, but nonetheless, it came from Washington's lieutenant, a member of the Continental Congress and governor of Virginia, Henry Lighthorse Harry Lee. Lighthorse Harry Lee would go on to father United States Colonel and Confederate General Robert Edward Lee. So that's kind of interesting. First in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen came from Lee's eulogy of the former president. We've heard,
cool.
I thought it was kind of cool. We've heard plenty of lore surrounding Washington, including the famed story of chopping down the cherry tree, which is, of course, lore as far as we know. Many people talk about his wooden teeth. He had severe tooth decay, which many of us get these days. That said, at least part of that narrative is interpreted incorrectly. When you're told it as a kid, you're told he had wooden teeth. It actually wasn't wooden teeth that were used as dentures, but rather a combination of animal teeth and human teeth, including that of enslaved human teeth. I don't know how you justify that. I mean, I know you've got to have teeth, but good Lord, that just seems so interesting to have other people's teeth and maybe even like horse or pig teeth. I don't know, in your mouth. I don't, yeah.
Disgusting. Yeah, pass.
Yeah. It's hard pass. Hard pass. So faith in public life. Who was Washington in terms of a religious leader, and what did he have to offer the country? President Washington believed in forms of appropriate public expressions of religiosity, which would differ from that of his people who would follow him as president, including John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, who were staunchly believers in the separation of church and state. Washington was a lifelong Anglican. He was baptized in April of 1732 in that tradition. He would later serve on the vestry of Fairfax Parish, which would later become Christ Church of Alexandria, Virginia, which is a beautiful parish, beautiful people, just a beautiful church there in Alexandria. Yeah, again, shout out. They don't sponsor us.
Not sponsored, but hey.
Even still, the president could more likely be described as what would be considered a deist, despite his identity within the Anglican communion. This also is part of the kind of the Anglican identity during the time, because Anglicans were trying to figure themselves out. They were the Church of England, of course. What happens to the Church of England after these pesky colonists decide that they are no longer part of the nation of England? And this is part of kind of anything that happens. He did, however, he was one of those first national opponents and stood in stark opposition to any form of evangelicalism or the turn and burn pastors of the era. Kind of same stuff, different day, right? I mean, we've got those still today, yet he was vehemently opposed to those kind of preachers and what they had to offer, not only the people that he knew, but the country at large. So what is deism? What is deism that this president espoused? Deism is the belief, kind of in a nutshell, that God as a creator created the ordered world, initiated the creation, yet in a sense of a clock-making God, if you sense. God created the world and let the clock work rather than continuing to tinker with the affairs of humankind. That is also a kind of Unitarian view in the sense of Jesus was a good prophet, maybe even divinely inspired prophet, but was not part of the Trinitarian Godhead, which is what many Protestant presidents would espouse later on after Washington. He often referred to God as creator, or other terms, maybe not directly as God. There's no knowledge of him mentioning Jesus Christ in public or private correspondence. That said, he was able to, and quite often, quoted the Book of Common Prayer of the Anglican Communion of the Church of England and scripture that resonated with him throughout his life. He was deeply concerned with religious pluralism, meaning that he believed that everyone had a place at the table. That included his diversity and equity towards other people in the separation of church and state. And many people make such an example of that for his presidency after that and before that. He prohibited and was vehemently opposed, again, to anti-Catholic sentiment for people who were serving while he was commander-in-chief of the colonial army. He refused to have any kind of notion that you could be against someone based on their religious preference. Finally, to suggest, as some American evangelicals suggest today, that George Washington founded this nation on a Christian faith or a theocratic notion of what it means to be a nation, is really both an affront to who George Washington was and a gross mixed characterization of George Washington's views. George Washington was, insofar as we can tell, a person of faith, but to suggest that he was a Judeo-Christian founder, I think goes a bridge too far. So that gives us an idea. The interesting thing is I was learning about this is, gosh, what happened during George Washington's term? It's a lot of like spinning up anything. There was a lot of firsts. There were first appointments to positions that needed to be appointed to. There were figuring out the ways in which this Constitution might be enacted and affected. There were ways in which they figured out how to be a nation together. And it was a really exciting time. It was also a really scary time for some people too, because they were unsure. That said, to have Washington as the head of the ship of state was something of importance for a lot of people. So with that said, Scott, you've got 3 questions that you've prepared or have thought about. Why don't you ask them?
Yeah, I have a couple more than 3, and you can like maybe
that's fine.
the ones you don't want or something like that. So I was wondering about. We'll start here. Anglicanism, I guess Anglicanism. Is that how you say that?
Anglicanism.
Anglicanism. All
It's
right,
sad.
cool.
You're an
Edit that
Episcopalian.
out.
You should know that.
Here we go.
So.
Here we go. Yeah. No, I'm not technically.
You sing in an Anglican church, but go ahead.
Yeah, but still, like it's different. I sing there. I work there. I don't go there. Here
Okay.
we are.
Okay. Go ahead with your question.
Methodist deep down, baby. So how long before? So this was coming over from the ship. It was clearly like of the day. So why Anglicanism? Like the only other thing there was Catholicism, or what was the religious landscape at the time? Is what I'm guessing. Like that was my question: is what's the religious landscape we have? Is it like sort of a schism between the two? Is Christianity
That's really a
around?
good question. Anglicanism was kind of one of the prevailing forces, especially where Washington lived in Virginia, in the colony of Virginia. That said, in other places up towards Rhode Island, it could have been the Baptist faith or Congregationalist faith. John Adams, the next president that we'll talk about in this podcast, was a president who was Unitarian or Congregationalist, and that was something that was very prevalent. It kind of depended on where you were in the colonies. Interestingly, you mentioned Methodism. John Wesley visited the colony of Georgia while he was living, and interestingly fell in love with a woman on the boat ride over. She wanted to get married right away. He had to go minister to the native population. He used a much more crass term than that, but we won't use it here. And so he said, we'll hold off. And she didn't want to hold off, so she got married to someone else. He, in turn, came back and became the 3rd rector of Christ Church, Savannah, and then ended up refusing her communion. Which to the people of the town, they did not like that. They did not like the way that Wesley was treating his ex, especially as a religious person. And so they ran him out of town, and Wesley considered Georgia to be one of his worst failures. So you see, you've got this relationship between the mother church in England and its colonial reality. Another Wesley, Charles, preached at the Old North Church, where I had the opportunity to preach earlier this year. And one of the interesting things they talk about during the American Revolution is that since Anglican priests had sworn an allegiance to the king, they themselves, many of them fled during the American Revolution or took up arms against, kind of swapped allegiances. The rector at the time at the Old North Church closed the church down. He said there's no way. He left. He was getting out of town when the shots were fired at Lexington and Concord. And in fact, I think the Old North Church was closed for 3 years because of that. So that's to say Anglicanism was a very much prevailing force at the time. Washington knew that Anglicanism was becoming the Episcopal Church, the Protestant church, Episcopal Church in the Americas was becoming the kind of church that would be a church that was for leadership. That said, you could also see that in some Unitarian congregations and other places. So we talk about that at length in our denominational episodes that you can check out too. So I hope that answers your question. But it was part of course, the Church of England but after the war, it became the Episcopal Church that we know today.
Great. And then I guess piggybacking off of that, did the split from England have something like, did it affect the theology of the Anglican Church? So, like, let's say, there's no more swearing to the king. Do they swear to the president? Like, what do they do? Swear to God? Like,
Right,
where do they
right.
swear to?
There's actually a really interesting, again, to use the Old North Church as the example. They have a prayer book that's in their archives that where literally the allegiance and prayers to the king, um, which the clergy would take the allegiance, and of course during the prayer service you would pray for the king, as today in the Episcopal Church you like normally you'd see in a Episcopal Church the prayers of the people. They'd say for Joe our
Yeah,
president, in our state
you go down the line. Yeah,
Roy our
yeah.
governor. That's kind of the change it took. But you can actually see in black ink the prayer book where they marked out the prayers for King Charles, and the ways in which that affected them must have been both seismic in that this was a big shift for them. I mean, this was the church, this was the established Church of England. I mean, we can go back further into history and see the ways that the Church of England persecuted people to make them come to the colonies. And so you really had one choice. You had one way. And so this new way of life for the Episcopal Church became such that there were other options, and that was a little different for them. But beyond that, the allegiance was no longer to the king. It was to God and to supporting this new nation.
Were they heavy on like Jesus died for your sins, or was it just like a kind of like a Catholicism type thing going on still, or how did faith change? Because I know that I would imagine that there's some sort of shift in belief over time, right? Because I feel like Anglicans now, there's no way that some of their beliefs are the same than back then. So,
Right. Well, there was some
how?
shifting. I think there was some anti-Catholic sentiment, obviously, even then. Now, granted, today there are Anglo-Catholic parishes across the country, and there's a deep respect that the Episcopal Church and the Anglican Communion has for that of the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church. But that said, I think too one of the things that shifted um, was this realization that for many that things were changing. Things were not what they once were. Um, some of the first bishops of the church had to figure out new ways of doing things, and that's not always easy for people. That said,
Oh
there
God,
are
doing that in the church, that's crazy.
right,
New
yeah,
ways of
new
doing
things. Any
things.
new things in the church is crazy, but I think there are some instances of evangelical fervor, and you can talk about the Second Great Awakening that would happen later in the nation's history. But beyond that, I think that they were reckoning with themselves and what was happening in the country.
Okay, here's my next question. I would love your thoughts on deism. When I was a teenager, a sprouting teenager, deism was very cool to me, and I so shout out deism. But what are your thoughts on deism, and how did they fit into the Anglican, I guess, Book of Common Prayer or something to that extent, their beliefs? Because for me, I think that it's take like God's in the back seat almost in deism. Uh, and I don't know if God's in the back seat for Anglicans. So if there's a question
Yeah,
there.
I think what goes well is that Anglicanism or the Episcopal expression of faith pairs well with other expressions of faith. Like you can be a deist and an Episcopalian or an Anglican.
And still pray to him, even
Yeah,
though
yeah,
it's
yeah.
not
Even though
gonna like
and
he's
in
hands
fact,
off,
there's some liberal, I mean, very liberal Episcopalians. You think of John Shelby Spong, who was the bishop of the Episcopal Church, who died not too long ago. He was well known for his controversial views that all of this stuff was very deistic. So it goes well. As for me, and to be careful about interjecting personal views here, I think the thing that is hard is that, like, I want a God who gets down in the gutter. What's that Oscar Wilde line? All of us are in the gutter. Some of us are just looking at the stars. I love that line because it makes me think that perhaps God could get down with us in the gutter and stay there with us and know that we have a presence, like there's proximity to God. That is not something that's offered in deism. I could see why deism would be appealing to the very intellectually minded and the very intellectually based people. But that said, for me, I don't see the merit and the value as much in it as someone who might be more concerned with the intellectualism of faith.
So you're more of like a Carrie Underwood, Jesus take the wheel type person.
Well, seeing as they didn't have cars when Jesus was around, I don't know if I want Jesus to take the wheel.
That's true. He probably doesn't know how to drive.
He doesn't know how
but
to
he could
drive.
miracle Lord.
I mean, he can figure it out.
do
I
something.
mean, sure, he's probably pretty
Yeah.
good at figuring things out. But
Did he start the hand on the Bible thing? Like, was he, when he was sworn in, was he the first guy to be like, I'm going to put my hand on a book? Oh, and it's going to be the Bible. Or did they go through forms of like, I wonder what thing we're going to put our hand on today to swear in? Or was it automatically the Bible?
President Washington did start the tradition of being sworn in on the Bible to take the presidential oath of office as prescribed in the Constitution. The oath of office is, I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will faithfully execute the office of the President of the United States and to the best of my ability preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. And so,
were you reading that?
I know that by heart. It's kind of weird, but and people have added, of course, at the end, "So help me God," where this podcast gets its name. That said, a president that we'll talk about here in a few episodes, President John Quincy Adams, who was a very religious man, he still chose to take the oath of office on the copy of a book of constitutional law rather than that of the Bible, because he believed that the separation of church and state was paramount to what was going on. So that leads me to a question to you. What book would you swear in on if you couldn't swear in on the Bible?
Ooh, I don't know. Ooh, probably a Harry Potter. No, I'm just messing.
Oh,
I'm just
God.
messing. That's funny. That's funny.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's good. Probably The Prophet.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a solid book for our readers to look up.
Book recommendation. Okay. Anyway.
Yeah.
Hold
Hold on. I got one last question. Methodism not around yet.
Methodism is very much around in
Okay.
in that time, and in
Has there
fact,
ever been a Methodist president?
there have been. We'll talk about some. There have been quite a few, and one of the ones that we'll talk about later on in the episode or in the podcast is had a very subsequent, very consequential decision of public policy that was impacted because of his Methodist faith, and that's President William McKinley, who we'll talk about later. So, but the American presidency devotes considerable admiration and affection to the first of the 46 administrations. And this is so interesting, Scott. I have to say this. You know, we say the 46 presidents. There's actually only been 45 men who have served as president and 46 administrations. Grover Cleveland served non-sequential terms. There was a president between him. So there was Grover Cleveland, Benjamin Harrison, and Grover Cleveland, but we count him as two. So technically 46 administrations, 45 people. There's significant people who admire President Washington. He is on the dollar bill. George Washington's term was both trend-setting and novel. The problem with anything or anyone being venerated is that they often fall short of the high ideals that we as a nation hold them to. Does Washington deserve a monument? Does he deserve a place on Mount Rushmore? The affinity of being first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. It's difficult to weigh out the pros and cons when over 500 enslaved lives are involved. Look, I don't have the answers to these difficult questions, but I do think they are important ones to keep in mind and important ones to give a careful examination of the American presidency that must be coupled with an honest appraisal of the people that held that office and how that office was thrust upon them at the time of their serving. To fail to do so is not only an injustice to the standard bearers and the people they sought to serve, but also to the American Republic. So what's up next, Scott? What do we have next week? Next up, our next episode, whenever you listen to it, When I set out on this podcast and I began to research this project for my doctoral work, I began to see eras that were of great importance to this nation, with through lines by which the American presidency is predicated on. That meant that you will see, just like Taylor Swift has her Eras tour, we'll see eras often represented by a president, followed by a president immediately following him. This is the equivalent of a theological Eras tour by Taylor Swift, only we are not making as much money or having as much impact. Next up, we have a president that is often considered being a preacher and thought of himself as a church-going animal. He was our nation's first vice president, our second president, our next president on the next episode of So Help Me Pod. To be better understood, will be President John Adams, the second president of the United States of America. As always, thank you for listening. You can check out more information on our database, www.robley4.com/presidents. And you can check out past episodes and see what we're up to next. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time. You've been listening to So Help Me Pod, a podcast of Beloved Journal in conjunction with Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley, California. The podcast is offered in partial completion of the Doctor of Ministry degree for the Reverend Robert W. Lee. All opinions and insights offered are solely owned by that of those who offered them and do not reflect the views of stakeholders in the project. There have been 45 men and 46 presidential administrations, all of them unique. Some of them have been more interesting than others, some of them more terrifying than others. All have been part of the grand expression of democracy on the North American continent and part of the wider conversation of self-governance in the world. These men have failed profoundly, and we have failed profoundly in following their leadership along with our own sometimes antiquated and backwards ways of viewing and acting in the world. That said, this form of leadership is unlike few other, and the greatest gift we have has been given in the ways in which the American experiment continues to prosper despite our terrible misgivings. We are better off because of these men, and we are forever in their debt. For more information, visit www.robley4.com/presidents.